Good evening, and on behalf of Church House Bookshop and Hodder Stoughton, I'm delighted to welcome you to this special evening of conversation to mark the launch today of Chine McDonald's new book, God is Not a White Man. My name is Catherine Venn. I'm Chine's editor at Hodder, and I'm just going to say a few words of introduction to let you know the shape of the next hour. We are delighted that we have Dr. Sanjee Perera here with us this evening for a conversation with Chine about her book. So I'm going to hand over to them in a minute for about 40 or 45 minutes of conversation. And for the last 10 minutes or so, they'll be answering questions. So if you'd like to ask about anything about the book or anything that comes up in their conversation, just type it into the chat box. And if you can do this by 6:30, that'll give us the chance to look at all your questions, though we'll probably only have time to answer around 4 or 5. If you haven't already, please do get hold of a copy of the book. Church House Books, our host for the evening, are selling them at the special price of £13.59. Just this week, I think that is. So now it's my great pleasure to introduce you to Sanjee and Chine. Dr. Sanjee Perera is a cognitive ecclesiologist and the current Archbishop's advisor on minority ethnic Anglican concerns in the Church of England. She's also an Associate Fellow of the Open University's School of Law, advocating on various projects, including on immigration, citizenship and governance. And she's an Honorary Research Fellow at the University of Chester and a Visiting Fellow at Coventry University's Centre for Trust, Peace and Social Relations. Her research brings a cognitive psychological framework to philosophy, theology and religion, particularly focusing on racialised stakeholders in the Church of England. And Chine McDonald, our author, is Head of Public Engagement at Christian Aid. She read theology and religious studies at Cambridge University before training as a newspaper journalist, and over the years has written for several regional and national publications. She's a regular contributor to BBC Religion and Ethics programmes, including Thought for the Day on Radio 4's Today programme, The Daily Service, Pause for Thought and Prayer for the Day. Chine's first book was Am I Beautiful, which explored body image among Christian women. And Chine sits on a number of charity boards, including Greenbelt Festival, the Church and Media Network, and Christians Against Poverty. Chine regularly speaks and writes on issues of race and faith. So we're here this evening to listen to Sanjee and Chine talk about Chine's new book, God is Not a White Man and Other Revelations, which is publishing today. Congratulations, Chine. In it, she asks us to consider what it means when God is presented as male and what it means when God is presented as white. And these are challenging and urgent questions which she explores while sharing her experience of being a Black woman in the white majority space that is the UK Church. It's a challenging and humbling read and part of a vitally important conversation, which we're going to be diving right into tonight. So I do hope you enjoy listening to the conversation this evening. So Sanjee and Chine, good evening. Over to you.
How lovely to meet you today, Chine. I must say that I feel like I know you having read your book and having read your book twice for different purposes, but how lovely to really meet you in person. So, Chine, start us off by telling us a little bit about the book, and then I'll start to interrogate you as cognitive psychologists do in my own special way.
Yes, so the book really wanted to give voice to the Black British female Christian perspective into issues of race and faith. And obviously the book title is God is Not a White Man. And there is a part of the book, a significant part of the book, which is about the literal depictions of God, as we've seen over centuries, as white and male. But it also talks about the problems of white supremacy and patriarchy in general, and how that's pervasive both in the church and in theology, but also in other parts of society, including international development, the sector in which I work, interracial relationships I write about, my marriage to my husband, depictions of Africa, as well as church, and kind of the feminism as well. So it talks about or explores the question of whether or not God is a white man, but also part of the there's an intended double meaning, which is God is not a white man, but also white men, as in white supremacy and patriarchy, white men are not gods, so white men aren't the default human. But I wonder if you wanted me to read a section that gives us a kind of introduction into the kind of point of view that I'm writing from, and it's from the preface. And I start by talking about my how I studied theology at Cambridge. And I went to Cambridge wanting to be a journalist, but studied theology. But my lecturer told me that I wrote like a journalist, and that wasn't a positive thing. So let me read here. Like the journalist I wanted to be, I had attempted to take myself out of the story, achieving in my essays the goal of being that objective writer, a faceless observer. I had presented few of my own thoughts, feeling them to be unimportant and potentially distracting in writing academic essays about the nature of God. I have spent much of my life continuing to do this, making myself smaller, accommodating the expectations of how others want the world to be. While patriarchal influences draw a box in which women must sit and conform, white supremacy quietens the unique voice of the Black experience. There is not room for both. Perhaps I should have listened much earlier to the lesson that my Cambridge supervisor taught me, that my voice matters, not merely in the social justice or political sense, but because when it comes to theology, the personal account is just as important as the historic, academic, or intellectual. In the same way, my life experiences also matter. We are part of the story. This is arguably more true of theological explorations than it is of any others. Since God cannot be seen or touched in a physical sense, we can only experience God spiritually in our inner beings, and our experience of God can then only be relayed through our words, our speech, a translation exercise taking place in which communicating our experience of God cannot escape being shaped by our histories, our social contexts, our genders, our racial backgrounds, our individual stories. How can God be revealed except through the variety of different personal stories, physical realities, and cultural contexts in which humans experience God's presence? A 17th century philosopher John Locke wrote, "God, when he makes the prophet, does not unmake the man."
Thank you for that. Now, I know you have already answered this, but I'm going to push this further. And as you know, I spend a lot of time on Twitter, as do you, I think.
Yes.
It has become almost a stressed reaction. Whenever I hear something, I always think, what will Anglican Twitter say about this? Or even, what will right-wing Twitter say about this? What will be the pushback? So if I pushed you back saying nobody actually believes that God is a white man, so why even go there? What is the reason? What is the point? I know you've touched on this, but can we first start with the man part of it? What does it mean to have a gendered God or have a gendered expression of God? So as a cognitive psychologist, for an example, research suggests, Lira Boroditsky's research suggests that languages that have a grammatical gender that has a nominative gender for, so if you talk about the sun or the moon, if there's a nominative gender, the way they describe the sun or the moon would be different. So German speakers, where the moon is feminine, would use very feminine metaphors in describing the moon, whereas Spanish speakers, where the moon is masculine, they'd have very masculine ways of describing this. Enormous amounts of linguistic evidence to say this, but will you tell us what that means in a theological framework? What does it mean to or even a journalistic, media analysis framework? What does it mean to gender God?
Yes. So one of the things that I have been increasingly aware of is the importance of translation, biblical translation, and the effect that has on how we see God or our place in the world. I think if we are to look back at the original texts in which, the original Hebrew, for example, in which the Old Testament is written, there are masculine ways of describing God, and there are feminine ways of describing God, and there are neutral ways of describing God. However, in the translation exercises that have gone on over the centuries, translated by white men who have translated the Bible through the patriarchal contexts and in which they have found themselves, we have lost that sense of God as being neither male nor female or both, and we have reduced God to male pronouns. And one of the things that I do in my book is I don't use any male pronouns to describe God. And that was a deliberate exercise, and it's not something that I had naturally done. And that's because of 37 years of describing God as he. But I felt it was really important in writing a book that was called God Is Not a White Man, to practice that exercise of describing God as God, not as he. So there is that. I would say, however, I have been, I wouldn't say surprised, but that kind of question around right-wing Twitter and lots of the media that I've been doing over the past few weeks, some people do think that God is a white man. Some people do think that Jesus is a white man. So some of the responses that I get sometimes, I wrote a piece in the Times last week, which it was called The Church Needs to Get Rid of Its White Jesus Problem. And I had lots of people on Twitter basically criticizing me, saying that I was playing into some kind of woke agenda to rewrite history, as if my saying that Jesus was not a white man, not a white person, was like casting a black man as Bond or black people in Shakespeare, as if I'm trying to make things politically correct. Obviously, we know that Jesus was a Middle Eastern Jewish person, so he was not a white European. But I think a lot of people in the UK, I think obviously not theologians or people who are active in church, think that Jesus was white. Think that the Bible is full of white people. And that Christianity is about Christendom and about Englishness, and Christianity being Britain's gift to the world, to the savages. So people do actually think that. But whether or not they do think that, I think we can say intellectually we know that God is not a man and that God is not white. But if you walk into any cathedral in the UK, or if you ask someone to picture God, including myself, I picture a white man, and that's because of centuries of images that have portrayed God as such.
You are right. I often say that, nobody actually believes God is a white man. But then when I taught a little theology at Birmingham University, one of the modules we did, we did a section on British Israelism, which looks at, which is one would say a heresy that believes that the 12 tribes are actually all white European tribes. So there are these glorious spaces that do believe that kind of literary truth. But again, to go back to gender, I pray because I was lucky enough to have a wonderfully supportive father who embodied the best of maternal and paternal attributes. I am most comfortable praying God my Father or our Father. Now, this is not true for everyone. Do you think that it has a particular impact on the human psyche? Not to make you a psychologist, but we psychologists apparently always ask about our relationships with our fathers and mothers. Do you think that it has an impact on people to pray God the Father or God the Mother? Do you think that that shapes our relationship with the divine in any way?
Yeah, I think it must do. I'm fortunate to have a very close relationship with both my mother and my father. So when I pray God the Father, it doesn't mean something negative to me. It doesn't kind of evoke a negative imagery. However, I think what we do when we pray only God the Father, exclusively God the Father, is potentially we lose something of the bigness, the vastness of God, and we lose kind of various different interpretations of who God is. So Dr. Will Gaffney talked about a particular passage in the Old Testament which describes the mother love of God. And so I think it's almost like potentially whether or not you have had that positive relationship with your parents, I think we all have an understanding of what that mother love should be, or the kind of ideal sense of mother love as nurture and care. One of the things that I think is problematic in the alignment of God with maleness and masculinity, I think is one of the reasons why we have seen the alignment of Christianity with nationalism, or let's say Trump's evangelicals, Trump supporters, who are very much about Christianity, but their view of God and their view of Jesus is this macho guy who is about power, who wins, who wants to fight, is about battle. I don't think that they would have this, I guess, understanding or desire to see the other side, the other positive sides of God in the feminine. And I think so I think there's power in expanding our views and our language around God as both father and mother and other.
I quite like that, father, mother, and other. And you speak so fondly about your father. My father died about 4 years ago, yesterday. And when I was reading the bits about, sort of you reminiscing what it meant for your father, for you to go to Cambridge, I was thinking about my father, who went to such vast lengths to ensure that I was extraordinarily comfortable and scaffolded at university. And it reminded me how he felt or how he sort of walked the campus with me. And I just thought there's in those relational sort of the relationships we have with our parents, but also our familial close-knit community is often a way that we experience or we see a reflection of God. And I suppose you do that beautifully in the book. Tell me a little bit, at the risk of again sounding like a psychologist, tell me a little bit about the maternal. I was really aware that you've woven so beautifully the maternal and the paternal in the book. But tell me a little bit about that maternal presence. And you talked about the patriarchal system being about power, but the Christology and certainly the Gospels particularly show us the vulnerability of God, the sort of openness to hurt and pain for our sakes. Tell us a little bit of how you wove that. I loved the Christology in the book that came through between the maternal and the paternal. Tell us a little bit about your mother and how she weaves into that.
Thank you. So in the chapter which is on the Sisterhood, basically womanism, Black femininity and white feminism, I explore or I tell a story about my great-grandmother and how, I can't remember when it was, maybe 1940-ish, my grandmother and her brother were at school, and there was some kind of accident that happened, and some kind of mud blocks fell into the school, and my great-grandmother had been looking for my grandmother and her brother, and she was in the market, and when she heard about the accident at the school, she miscarried her baby. And I think I only met my great-grandmother once when I was very young, once or twice. But that story really connected me to her in the sense that what it means to be a woman, or the physicality of womanhood, and the connection that I feel to women, both Black women and other women of other colours, because there is something that holds us together. And I think I write about my particular relationship and my connection with Black women and how we see in each other, actually we see each other in a world that often doesn't see us. And it's in those places of connection, I think, and relationship that we experience something of God. And then I can then kind of move on to thinking about James Cone's description of Jesus in the cross and the lynching tree, Jesus as being someone who lays down the power and sides with the marginalized and oppressed and the brutalized. And it's in that vulnerability that the beauty is found as well, and that we experience God in that place of suffering, rather than the place of power, greatness, success, winning, all those things that I think are problematic.
Now, that actually perfectly segues into colour. So this book is predominantly, I would say, about colour or about ethno-racial identity. Tell us a little bit about what colour means. So traditional theology imagines the divine imprint on humanity, whether consciously or unconsciously, as white. So for a moment, I know the title is God is not a white man, but let's look at a little about humanity conversely. What does it mean that when we imagine humanity, we primarily imagine it in whiteness? So, for an example, not very long ago, even in our lifetimes, until in Australia, until the 1976 Land Rights Act and until the Mabo decision was reached in 1992, when the myth of terra nullius was overturned, Aboriginal people in Australia were legally classified under fauna and flora. And theologians, psychologists, criminologists, sociologists often have in the last so many years talked about people who are African, Afro-Caribbean, Asian, however amorphous group that people are blocked into, as being less or more criminal, less or more moral, less or more intelligent, less or more productive or hardworking. What does it mean to be the lesser human in the way academics and politicians and journalists represent us?
Yes, a large part of the book explores these questions of, a friend of mine described it as the idea that white people are the default human. And that idea is why we are still in the position that we are in today in terms of racial injustice. So you can kind of go back to Linnaeus's classification of people from, white at the top and to, various different colors, and then Negroes at the bottom. So for a long time, these ideas about Black people and non-white people as other has been problematic. And one of the things that I draw out in the book is the very, very uncomfortable reality that often it was the Bible or the Christian faith that was used to prop up these ideas. So I discovered a pamphlet that was written in 1900 by a man called Charles Carroll, which was called The Negro a Beast or In the Image of God. So there are various theological debates about whether Black people were made in the image of God, and whether Black people were actually humans or whether Black people were animals. There were all these kinds of debates about at what point in history or at what point in the creation story did Black people come in, whether did God create them, or are they kind of like an accident. And so there were various ways in which Blackness was seen as other and literally not made in the image of God. Now that runs through from centuries ago to the transatlantic slave trade, through to even the last century, in a way that Black people are seen as lesser. And right up until today, or even the murder of George Floyd, you realise that in some ways, sorry, my son has walked into the room. In some ways, Black people continue to be seen as lesser than white ones.
Hello, Mummy.
I'm particularly struck by in the last century or two how language has been used to dehumanize, whether it's people of color or even sort of in terms of other ways of we disenfranchise and marginalize people. Are there any lessons from history we might draw, do you think, in terms of what it means to dehumanize peoples by suggesting that they're...
Sorry.
All right, no worries. This is the joys of Zoom, real life as it happens. It's not in a studio. Are you all right there?
Sorry, his dad's coming.
Oh. So, what lessons from history do you think we might draw? Especially, as a journalist, you must know the power of dehumanizing people by suggesting they are bestial, suggesting they are, in some way a threat to the humanity that must be, the human race, which is white.
Yes, I explore lots of instances throughout history in which you see how Black people are seen as threats, and particularly Black men are seen as threats to white women. So sometimes you see it at the root of the problems that have happened. So, for example, a lot of the men that were lynched in America in the mid-20th century were lynched because they had either looked at white women in the wrong way. There were riots in 1919 in the UK in which there was this fear that of this, I guess, this mixing of blood and mixing of races. You realise that it comes down to power and fear of losing power, a fear of the so-called kind of dominant race losing out to others economically is a big thing as well. So I realise that there are lots of instances throughout history, but we continue to have vestiges of those views, and these views are uncomfortable, and I think lots of people are surprised that there were these views back then, but we need to face up to the fact that a lot of that continues till today. So how can we change the narratives around Black people actually being made in the image of God as equal, not lesser people who are then invited to the table, but as equal in God's creation?
Before we move on, I was going to read this passage, but I thought it might actually be better if you could read to us on page 119, if you can find it. Sorry, I should have given you a heads up. The nature of real conversations is that it under the section that says the mule of the world. Will you read to us a little bit about what you say about? I'm particularly interested about what you say about the white gaze and beauty.
Sure. So this is from the chapter called "The Sisterhood is Black and White." For centuries we have not been seen. In times past, the white men arrived in the land of our ancestors and did not see us as human, as worthy of our own homes, cultures, or dignity. Under the gaze of the white colonizers, for whom power and dominion were the most important things, the denigration of Africans in every way was a logical consequence. The colonizers could not in any way concede power to these so-called new people groups. So at every turn, they chose to show how Africans were lesser in intellect, in beauty, in form, and in spirituality. It is this perceived proximity to animals that made it easier to exploit Black bodies, to enslave them, to make white nations rich from the physical toil Black bodies faced. For Black women, the mule of the world, as the hero of Zora Neale Hurston's 1937 book, Their Eyes Were Watching God, describes them, there was an extra layer of denigration on top of the physical and emotional labour and exploitation. This idea that they would never be as lovely, pure, or revered as white women. Black women were hypersexual but not beautiful, And that is an important distinction. Journalist Afua Hirsch writes in her important book, British. Beauty was in some respects the first racism. European chroniclers of Africa were keen to cast the African body as the darkness that contrasted to the light of whiteness, the supposed ugliness of its women as proof of the beauty and superiority of the white female form.
This particularly resonated with me, but particularly a concept, at the risk of going to your first book, going into the idea of beauty and high culture. So in university spaces, if you took a batch of students that might be studying art history or theology or philosophy, they're more, or they're people of color are less represented. There's an assumption that high culture is not something that we're interested in. And as somebody who dwells in those spaces, why do you think, what are the gatekeeping mechanisms that keeps Black scholars out of spaces that are, in history, in archaeology, in ballet, in opera? What keeps them out, do you think? And do you think that it has anything to do with this particular concept of beauty, or a love of beauty?
Yeah, I think it's about that whiteness as being the default, but also whiteness as aligned with goodness and beauty and intellect and all the positives. And the corollary of that is Blackness as seen as ugly, lazy, stupid. There are various quotes from lots of the theologians that I studied at university, Enlightenment theologians, about the place of Black people, and their kind of lack of intellect. So I think that is the reason why we still continue to see disparities in certain sectors of society between white people and Black people. So even if you look at sport or look at football, for example, where obviously there are lots and lots of Black footballers, loads and loads. Obviously there's still racism on the pitch, but there are lots of Black footballers. However, there aren't, I think, any Black managers of football teams, because yes, obviously Black people are good at sport. They're physical, they're strong, but they're not very clever. So they therefore can't be managers. And you see that replicated across lots of different areas of society. So I think there is that, but I think there's also when Black people do enter into those spaces, they experience an othering, or like they don't belong there, or people are surprised that they are there. So I write about my first night at Cambridge during matriculation dinner. I sat next to an older white male fellow who, when the dinner came around, he looked down at my plate and he said, "Oh, I bet you're not used to this kind of food at home." And it was kind of chicken and potatoes, which I had before. And I immediately felt like, oh, I didn't belong there, or people didn't think I should be there. So I think until we rewrite those narratives, until we stop othering the Black people who are in those spaces, we're going to continue to see Black people potentially creating their own spaces in which their intellect is not questioned and their beauty isn't questioned.
Do you know, that was one of the stories that really resonated with me again. I was, a couple of years ago, I went on a walk in the sort of North Yorkshire moors, and I saw a butterfly, and I thought, you shouldn't exist. Somewhere in my head, I think that, this butterfly is supposed to be extinct. So I took a picture, I posted it on Twitter. I certainly didn't go out thinking I'm going to rediscover a butterfly. So this is a butterfly that is extinct in England. It's certainly, it's around in Scotland, and it was certainly the sort of, it's a re-emerged butterfly. But I came back to my community. I was at a sort of a retreat house, and somebody said to me, a white clergyman actually said to me, so it kind of took a life of its own. Sort of people got very excited that this butterfly had reemerged, and people are saying that it hadn't discovered a butterfly, but had rediscovered a butterfly. And this white clergyman said to me, it's just, I wish you came back to us and told us about this without putting it on social media. It's just a bit odd when a foreigner finds one of our butterflies. And I just thought, what? And until that point, I hadn't really considered myself, having lived here for more than half my life, hadn't really considered my foreignness, I suppose, not quite to the extent that I wasn't allowed to comment on the fauna and flora around me. And then, I had that comment again and again and again. And I just thought, in various facets, but sort of it, and I realized that even spaces of knowledge are that there are gatekeepers of ethnicity. I found that extraordinary. And coming from the university sector, where that would be hilarious, I just thought, is this something particular about ecclesial spaces or churchy spaces? But that story again resonated because I get asked to make curry quite a bit from in ecclesial spaces, and until quite recently, I had no clue. Cooking was a more recently acquired skill, and I always think there are lots of other skills I can offer. But moving on, I'm just very aware of the time, and we've dwelt on one particular section, and there's just so many questions I want to ask you that I want a couple of hours. But okay, let's look at this book and the way you might frame it. Tell me, so if you were putting this book on a bookshelf in Birmingham University Library, Oxford or Cambridge libraries, where would you put it? Would it be in the contextual theology section? Would it be practical theology, liberation theology? Would it be lamentation literature? Would you put it next to Afua Hirsch's book or next to Azariah Francis Williams or next to Robert Beckford's or Anthony Reddy's? Where does this book belong on a shelf?
Yes. I would love to be in between Afua Hirsch's British and Will Gaffney's Womanist Midrash, because I think I have recognised that what I have done is womanist theology, which is theology through the lens of Black women. But I think I don't want it to be pigeonholed into a theology book, because I'm also talking about society. It's in general, and I've been really amazed and pleased that so many of the people I know who aren't Christian have bought the book and are really interested in it, because it really speaks to our times about the place of Black people, about racial justice, about Black Lives Matter. And what I want to do through them reading about those things is to understand that my view of God, my understanding of Jesus and the Christian faith, is about a faith that sides with the marginalized and the oppressed, and that doesn't do a lot of things that people think the church does, which is wants to protect its own power and wants to kind of exclude people. I want to paint a picture of the Christian faith as completely inclusive, and a God that is inclusive and open-armed. So I think a sociological commentary, but also womanist theology.
That's exciting. What about those people who say, well, it doesn't belong in theology at all? There is a sort of a particular kind of thinking that suggests that Black theology is not proper theology. Black theology is so focused on the human experience that it is not appropriately focused on the sacred. What would you say to those commentators that said this doesn't belong in the, this or Anthony Reddy or Azariah Francis Wilson, would none of those belong in the theology section? That's just lamentation literature. What would you say to them? what is the Christology, or what is the eschatology, or what theological strains is most important to you in this book?
So I would say it's liberation theology and eschatology, because the picture that I paint of the kingdom of God, or the Christian faith, is one in which at the end of all things, we are all called to be one, all made in the image of God, and that despite what we see, the oppression and marginalization of people groups in the now, in the not yet, there will be, because of God's incarnation, death and resurrection, all those things will be brought together. Now, I find it frustrating when people might suggest or critique Black theology, even I guess the concept of Black theology as kind of separate from the default, which is white theology, and white theology done by men of the 19th and 18th centuries predominantly. That too was contextual. Theology has to be contextual because we can't see and touch God, so therefore it has to be contextual. But all theology is contextual, not just Black theology. I guess I understand what people might be saying when I think someone described it as theology done through tears, but I think Lamentations does exist in the Bible, and I think that we're not yet at the place where we can let go of that and move on as if everything is sorted. So Black theology is theology. All theology is contextual.
Now, I'm going to push you once more in 2 sentences. If you deeply, deeply cared about somebody who is just completely resistant to this idea that this was real theology, how would you compel someone's heart? How would you compel them to the beauty of Black theology? What is it about Black theology that makes it deeply Christological?
So the central tenet of the Christian faith is God becoming nothing, coming into human form, being like us, and going through the brutalization of his body in order in order for our salvation and resurrection. And if that is the central theme of the Christian faith, then Black theology that experiences God as with them, Jesus is with us, and Black theology as recognizing how God can be found and aligned with a Black man who has been lynched. I think that has to be important for all of us to get a vision of, not just Black people. And there are all sorts of kind of marginalized groups, all sorts of people who need to hear the message and that God is with them, no matter what the situation is.
A very long time ago, I considered studying journalism, and you can tell that I would have been made a very poor journalist, because I want to spend a lot of time examining the one concept for a long time rather than running through. And as a result, I have about 20 questions I haven't asked you. But let's go back to framing the book. You have already talked about this in the book, but very quickly, tell me, who are the forebearers of this book? Who are the sort of real influences? But also, will you tell me some unlikely conversation partners? So I often like to read books together. So if I read this, I'm likely to read a book alongside this that does push that sort of virtue aesthetics of whiteness and white superiority, so that I might understand the tensions between these two. And for me, then it brings through the real tensions of the human existence and the spaces in between that I should focus in. So who are the influences, and who are the conversation partners that might give us some alterity?
So the influences, I think or I can, and others might also fall into the trap of thinking that these conversations are new when they've been happening for years and years and years. And so, yeah, the people that have influenced my thinking include James Cone in the US, but also in the UK, Anthony Reddy, Robert Beckford, people like Rosemary Mallett, people who have been talking about Black liberation theology and its practical implications for the church for, since before I was born. So those would be people who have influenced me. The unlikely other books I'd want people to read alongside it. I'm not sure if this is possible, but well, I think positively, two books that I would love to be in a conversation with would be Jesus and John Wayne by Kristin Kobes-Dumais, which charts the kind of alignment of American Christianity with masculinity and nationalism. And then a new book by Beth Allison Barr called The Making of Biblical Womanhood, because I think there are so many themes that, and those are two white women. And I think that there is so much that resonated with me in reading their work about history, about power, and about biblical translation. So I'd love to be in a conversation with them. But otherwise, I'd love someone, from the Southern Baptists to be in conversation with me and see how that went.
For me, the real beauty and the real joy is to find those disagreements and then find why there are those disagreements. I often am less interested in what people say than in why people what they say. And sometimes I find in my calling, the calling is to understand those fears and anxieties and lull them not even lull them, to respond to them with honesty and truth and pain and grief. And I found that a lot of that coming through in your book. And, Theology Through Tears is a particularly beautiful way of putting it, because the reality is there's that trope of angry Black woman. We have to keep our voices so calm and, almost like a lullaby. Because anything less, and we will be accused of being angry, of being polemic, of fragmenting society. And I just caught this beautiful thread, this silver thread running through this book, of being vulnerable in our fears and our anxieties, but at the same time showing beauty. Okay. Before we move on to questions are already coming through, but before we go on to that, my final question to you is: what are the learning curves in this book, and where would this book lead? What's the next book you might bring to the table?
I'm not sure if I can do it again. I wrote this book for a pandemic, with a full-time job, with a toddler who kind of causes chaos sometimes. If I was to, I think in writing the book, I realised that there are so many stories of Black dignity that I didn't know about. So from the enslaved women who led revolts on slave ships, to the Igbo women in Southeast Nigeria. I'm from the Igbo ethnic group who led a revolt against white colonizers. I would love to dig into those kinds of stories, kind of untold stories of Black women's struggle, and not, rather than being passive, the Black women who kind of go for it and question and don't stand for the status quo. And where I would like it to lead, the final chapter in the book, the first is around the kingdom of God as a mosaic. So how can we as the church come to this understanding of the kingdom of God as like a mosaic? So the pieces aren't uniform, they're all different colours, they somehow fit together, and when you stand back, they look beautiful. So how can we recapture that image for the church?
Again, that was an image I really liked. Beauty appeals to me. And there are lots of theologians and writers in that sort of very Eurocentric perspective who write beautifully, like Roger Scruton writes so beautifully about beauty. And then, breaks my heart because he often leaves us outside those fortresses of beauty. And I thought that your book was a response in some way that says there is beauty in this too. Okay, so let's look at some of the questions that are now streaming through from the audience. So question number 1 from our audience. If you could have this book put into anyone's hands and know that they'd read it cover to cover, who would that person be? Gosh, there's a lot of questions coming through. I hope we have time.
Okay, I'll be quick with this one. All I can think of is Donald Trump. I don't think he can read, so I don't know. I think it would be a white woman in a conservative evangelical church, a predominantly white church, just to give her an insight into my experience as a Black woman and maybe question some of the things that they might have grown up with. Let's leave that.
That sounds about right to me. So moving on to the next question. I can't get away from this question. I get asked this all the time, so I'd be interested to know what you think. Do you think there's hope for the Church of England?
I do think there's hope for the Church of England, and the reason why I think there is hope is because it feels like from the outside that from the top there is very much a willingness to engage with these issues and to not be defensive about them, which in certain other traditions, the response is things have got so much better. What are we complaining about? Critical race theory. Whereas it feels like in the Church of England, there is definitely a willingness. Now, that willingness might have existed for years and years and years, which has resulted in lots of reports. But I think with the latest report, there is that sense of, actually, we have lamented, now let's do something. And here are the practical ways in which we're going to change. So I definitely have hope for the Church of England.
I must say, having the extraordinary privilege of working with the 2 archbishops, I'm often, left breathless at the fact that they're possibly both much more radical than I am. They're certainly braver than I am. I'd like them to get it done very quietly. And, they stand for the gospel. So, yes, I stand with you. Even though my academic analysis, if I look at the numbers, if I look at structural and diagnostic issues around racialization in the Church of England, would be very, very negative. I would say that these kind of human behaviors are not, it's a wicked problem in management speak. It's not something that can be resolved easily. But at the same time, what is impossible with man is possible with God. So, we work with a God of impossibility. Question number 3. How hopeful are you in terms of the current conversation around these issues, both in the church and beyond? I know we've touched on this already, but...
Yeah, I go through ups and downs, feeling hopeful and not. I definitely felt like last year, following George Floyd's murder and the Black Lives Matter protests, that we were in a different space. And that different space was I was getting invited to talk in surprising spaces within the church. People who hadn't been part of the conversations before felt like they were opening up to asking the critical questions of themselves. So I'm hopeful about that. I guess where I tend to become pessimistic is whether it will lead to change, whether it's sustained. So we need to keep on pushing. I'm also hopeful. Part of the reason why I get pessimistic about it is because we've had these conversations surely for years and years and years, centuries. There have always been people who have been calling out for justice and equality for Black people. I think one of the things that we need to do is change the narrative. So I recently read Emma Dabbury's book, What White People Can Do Next. And she says, part of the reason why we're still in this situation is because the idea of white privilege, and which leads to white guilt, is not an attractive one for white people. So we need to actually show how the flourishing of Black people, of people of colour, will lead to the flourishing of all of us. It's much better for white people, if we live in a society where Black people don't get shot when they're jogging or in their beds. So how can we understand that this is not about charity and about guilt and giving up space and power, but about the flourishing of all of us?
So I understand question number 4 will appear on screen, but it has? Okay. So given that so much of Western art has depicted God as a white man, how do we move beyond this limited imagery in the local parish church?
I think there are lots of churches doing quite innovative things in just making sure that when you have an image of Jesus somewhere, and whether it's on a PowerPoint or in the church, that it's not a white, blue-eyed Jesus. I think it's important for us. Part of the incarnation is about contextualization, and I totally understand why in African contexts or Asian contexts or British contexts, Jesus reflects the society, the context. But the problem is that white Jesus is pervasive throughout the world, so that whiteness is held as superior. So how can we start to find other images of Jesus from different cultures, create different images? I tell the story about the 16th Street Baptist Church in the US that was bombed, and there's a stained glass window which had a white Jesus in it, and the face of Jesus was blown out of this stained glass window during a bomb. And a little community in Wales decided to raise money for the 16th Street Baptist Church to have a new stained glass window. And there was a Welsh designer who designed a black Jesus for that window. I think there's something powerful in images that we can recapture of Jesuses that don't look like Robert Powell.
I have, I think there are more questions coming in, but I'm also aware that we're running out of time. Can I throw one quick question, which is a big question at you? So one of the challenges I get all the time is this is Black Atlantic thought, the BLM movement and Black theology. What would you say from the UK context, how, we talked about the parish church, in how we imagine God, in how we imagine Christ, in how we imagine each other as the body of Christ, in the way we wrap it around whiteness? What does that mean for people of colour?
Sorry, repeat the question.
For those people who say Black theology is not relevant in the UK, but at the same time, the way we imagine Christ, the way we imagine God, and the way we imagine the church is very, very white. So, for example, let me give you a context. If I ask, whenever I say to if I say to a diocese, how many Black clergy do you have? They might say, yes, the city we live in is very multicultural, but the Church of England here is very white. So, there's just no one to put through. What would you say to that? How is Black Atlantic thought relevant to this particular context?
I think it's in the whether or not that I totally agree. You shouldn't be bussing in Black people to fill all white churches, but it's not necessarily just about representation. I think it's about thinking about theology, or thinking about doing a little bit more work when you're writing a sermon which reflects a diversity of views, including Black theologians, including non-white male Western thought and theological thought. So there are all sorts of ways to rethink how we present the Christian story. But I want people to see that as not as a chore or as something that is difficult and it's a tick box exercise to be politically correct. But I think in doing that, we make God bigger. God is not a white man. Because if God was a white man, then God would be small and narrow, whereas I want us to paint a more expansive and holistic, welcoming picture of who God is.
That is beautiful. And I think we're well past our time now. So thank you, Chine. That was extraordinarily helpful for my understanding of the book. And it has been such an extraordinary delight to meet you. Let me hand over to Catherine.
Can I just say quickly, Sanjee, thank you so much. But I also want to say, because I won't get an opportunity to do this again, just to say thank you to Catherine for commissioning the book. We had this conversation about this book years ago, and I'm just so delighted that it's finally here. So thank you for your help, and also to Rachel, who I think is on the call, who is the publicity person at Hodder, who has really helped push out this book. So thank you.
Thank you, Chine. That's really, really kind of you. Thank you both so much. Thank you, Sanjee, for hosting this wonderful conversation. Thank you, Chine, for your time. What a gripping conversation. So much for us to think about, so much to be challenged by. So I will just wrap up here just by continuing to thank people. Thank you, Church House Bookshop, for organising this evening. And thank you, everyone, for being here with us this evening, for your fantastic questions. Just a reminder again that you can get hold of Chine's fantastic book through Church House Bookshop. There is a link below, I think. Yep, there we go. So on behalf of us all, Dr. Sanjee Perera, Chine McDonald, Church House Bookshop, Hodder Stoughton, we hope you enjoy this evening and that you enjoy the book. Thank you very much and good night.